Welcome to The New Paradigm for Mankind, a weekly discussion between Lyndon LaRouche and his scientific associates, in which we investigate the true nature of the creative human mind and the ideas necessary for the progress of mankind. So what I'd like to present today is another view of what's become known as the second triad. This is a concept which Mr. LaRouche has developed in a number of his writings. The first triad being this relationship between Nicholas of Cusa, Filippo Brunelleschi, and Johannes Kepler, which represent a certain paradigm in science and a real revolution in science, which then there was a bridge from that triad through people like Leibniz and Riemann into this second triad, which is the triad of Albert Einstein, Max Planck, and Vladimir Vernadsky. So what I'd like to do today is to give a different view of this second triad, or a different angle in understanding what they were presenting and what the fight was which they represented. In previous episodes, we've developed certain aspects of that. This will be a different one, and there will be many other machinations of this because there's just too much to present in any kind of 1 hour format. So what I'd like to do is first set the table on what exactly the fight was which this second triad was up against, and their acknowledgement of exactly what the times were in which they were operating and what the nature of the fight was which they were engaged in. And you'll see, so I'm going to do this through a series of quotes primarily, so you'll get from their own writings exactly what their thoughts were and how they were approaching it. So I'd like to first start with a quote from someone who's not part of that triad, Erwin Schrödinger, but who is someone who at times was a real defender of Planck, of Einstein, against the positivists, against those who would try to reduce all of science down to a mathematical formula, to statistics, who denied principle, and who denied that there were real knowable physical causes behind processes in the universe, particularly at the quantum level. Now, just as a footnote, Schrödinger didn't always operate in that direction. At times, he did come under the sway of people like Bohr and the so-called Copenhagen gang, who at times had sort of beaten him into submission. And he also wrote a pretty bad paper on life, called What is Life? And I can tell you he had no idea what life is. Putting that aside, he did have some insight into what the fight was and where to locate what the fight was historically. So I'd like to just use a quote from him from a paper he wrote called Are There Quantum Jumps? Now the paper itself is interesting from the scientific side of what he's presenting because he's in a sense challenging the naive notion of continuity of space and time. And he really himself does, whether he's fully conscious of it or not, does harken back to the kind of idea that Leibniz is putting forward in what's known as the motion dialogue, Leibniz's motion dialogue, where Leibniz really does himself also challenges this idea of a naive conception of continuity of space and time, absolute space, absolute time, absolute continuity. So Schrödinger challenges that and presents an argument very similar to the argument Leibniz presents there. But what's interesting for today's discussion is how he starts that, which I think situates the fight as it was at that time. So this is written in 1952, and that date is relevant, particularly for those who've been following Mr. LaRouche's recent writings with his emphasis on what occurred in the period around 1900, which is the period in which Hilbert, under the influence of what Mr. LaRouche has called the most evil man of the 20th century, Bertrand Russell, Hilbert, under Russell's influence, launched this attack on science and basically tried to force science into a box which said, truth is unknowable, all you have is mathematics. All you basically have are the shadows of sense perception and your ability to categorize and use statistics and whatnot of those shadows. But reality is unknowable, principle is unknowable, and the human mind is, in a sense, blocked off from truth. So here's what Schrödinger says in the opening of this paper. He says, "Physical science incurs at present, so I believe, the grave danger of getting severed from its historical background. The innovations of thought in the last 50 years, namely going back to 1900, great and momentous and unavoidable as they were, are usually overrated compared with those of the preceding century." And he goes on, "Along with this disregard for historical linkage, there's a tendency to forget that all science is bound up with human culture in general, and that scientific findings, even those which at the moment appear the most advanced and esoteric and difficult to grasp, are meaningless outside of their cultural context." And then he goes on, "The disregard for historical connectedness, nay, the pride of embarking on new ways of thought, of production and of action, the keen endeavor to shake off, as it were, the indebtedness to our predecessors, are no doubt a general trend of our time. In the fine arts, we notice strong currents quite obviously informed by this vein. We witness its results in modern painting, sculpture, architecture, music, and poetry. There are many who look upon this as a new, buoyant rise, while others regard it as a flaring up that inaugurates decay." He goes on, "But I may say that whenever this trend enters science, it ought to be opposed." And so he clearly is reflecting what was an ongoing attack on real science and an attempt, explicit attempt, to break science from its historical context. That there is, though science develops in a nonlinear way, there is a certain development process. There's a certain invariant that travels through the evolution of the human mind, of ideas. And it was very explicit on the part of the people associated with the so-called Copenhagen interpretation to break science from that, to say we've entered a new domain, a domain outside of what we previously had thought of as science and as knowledge, and now we have to declare, because of certain things like the uncertainty principle, that reality is unknowable.
Yeah, they attacked Planck and Einstein as the old school.
Exactly.
As though they were out of date.
Right, exactly. And that's what Schrödinger's challenging, and I think that's the better side of who Schrödinger was. But as you saw, he also references what was going on in the arts, in culture. And so you see a very similar sentiment coming from Furtwängler, Wilhelm Furtwängler, who has produced probably the greatest recordings that we have access to from Beethoven, Brahms, Schubert. Mr. LaRouche recently has put a lot of emphasis on the value of the recording of Schubert's Ninth that Furtwängler conducted. And so here's what Furtwängler has to say along similar lines. He says, quote, and this is from a essay called The Principles of Interpretation. This is from 1934. He says, "More importantly, it has never been the performer's, today or in the past. The musician's confinement of his activity to one of performance is in any case not all that old. Who defined the style of reproduction but the creators? This they did either indirectly, through the new challenges and new visions in their works, which also change our perspective on the past, or directly as performers themselves. It was the creators, the composers, who provided the performer with his raison d'etre of his activity. Their very existence gave him a sense of direction and acted at the same time as a constant, if unconscious, controlling influence which protected him from the most blatant of misconceptions. All this was only possible, however, as long as composers felt themselves to be the natural heirs of consummators of the past, to which they had a living relationship. But since the, quote, new music, that is to say, since contemporary composers began to see themselves as being in opposition to the, quote, old music, and thus to their own past, they inevitably lost all inner relationship to this past. They were neither willing nor able to create a style of performance for a past that no longer interested them, leaving it instead to the professional interpreter. And he goes on in another essay, Thoughts for All Seasons. He says, in talking about Beethoven and what he had done, he then goes on, a similar situation obtains where the elements of musical language itself are concerned. We have reached a point where composers no longer dare to use simple, direct harmony for fear of repeating what has already been said. We are facing an impasse. One sign of this is the increasingly desperate search for absolute novelty, anything that is totally independent of meaning derived from old material. The theory of the quarter tone system is a case in point. And then he has later on in another essay, times have changed beyond recognition. It no longer takes courage to construct a senseless pile of sounds. Quote, bold experiments is the fashionable way to describe them. But it does take courage, a great deal of courage, to write a single common chord, a single natural phrase. There used to be an unwritten law of the natural mode of expression, which for centuries formed the basis of all genuine music. Does that law no longer apply? It is pointless, of course, to go on repeating things that have already been said, but equally senseless is the cult of novelty for its own sake, the encouragement of what a composer says simply because it has not been said before. And so Furtwängler also is reflecting on this trend that was taking over all of culture, this trend towards novelty, towards destroying a connection with the past, towards trying to impose a nonsensical identity on science, culture, everything. And so there was a recognition among those real geniuses of the time of what the enemy was and what they are fighting against. Now, someone else who really took up this fight was the person who, ironically, was the one who created the quantum revolution, Max Planck. Planck's the one who discovered the principle of the quantum of action, that you do have a certain kind of, that you have a discreteness, you have a quantization of action in the small. And, who is also, as Mr. LaRouche pointed out, is part of this third triad. Now, Planck, he fought against this trend, this new trend in science his whole life. He was probably one of the most committed scientists of all time in terms of his focus and dedication. And towards the latter part of his life, he also saw it necessary to now take up this fight against this trend this evil trend from this Hilbert-Zeusian faction. And so in a book that he wrote in the 1930s called Where is Science Going?, he takes up this fight very explicitly. And you'll see he expresses very similar sentiments to what we just heard. So in chapter 2 of this book, he starts the chapter which is titled, Is the External World Real? He says, we are living in a very singular moment of history. It is a moment of crisis in the literal sense of the word. In every branch of our spiritual and material civilization, we seem to have arrived at a critical turning point. This spirit shows itself not only in the actual state of public affairs, but also in the general attitude towards fundamental values in personal and social life. Many people say these symptoms mark the beginning of a great renaissance, but there are others who see in them the tidings of a downfall to which our civilization is fatally destined. Formerly, it was only religion, especially in its doctrinal and moral systems, that was the object of skeptical attack. Then the iconoclast began to shatter the ideals and principles that had hitherto been accepted in the province of art. Now he has invaded the temple of science. There is scarcely a scientific axiom that is not nowadays denied by somebody, and at the same time almost any nonsensical theory that may be put forward in the name of science will be almost sure to find believers and disciplines somewhere or other. And so he here is again reflecting a recognition and a fight against this current of irrationality, which is the current of Russell, to impose irrationality on the population in art, in science, in politics, to demoralize people and make them much more susceptible to oligarchical rule. Now, Planck didn't just stop at bitching or complaining about the circumstance. He really, in this book and other essays later in his life, took on this fight. And we've discussed elsewhere, which we won't get into the science of it or the metaphysics of it, but he really, at a certain point, he made sort of the revelation that mind is what's primary. He got to the idea that though he is someone who studied matter his whole life, physics, that he had to come to the understanding that what's most primary is mind, is the creative human mind. And so in this writing, in many of these essays, interestingly, he actually takes up an approach similar. I think it really echoes the kind of thing you find from Nicholas of Cusa, particularly his Didacta Ignorantia, where Cusa takes you through these various levels of knowledge. And Planck does the same thing, where he starts with taking on what are known as the positivists and sense perception. And so he actually uses the logic of the positivists to show where their system breaks down and where just the belief in the primacy of sense perception as the source of truth breaks down within its own confines. So he first attacks that level. Then he says we have to go to a higher level, which is the level of physics, of physical science. And he takes on the idea of causation, because the trend that was then raging in science from the positivists was that we no longer can say there's causation. Since fundamentally everything is undetermined, we can't say anything has a cause. All we can say is that there are statistical correlations. A is more likely to happen than B based off of a statistical interpretation. But we can't say that that came about as a result of any cause, or really what they're saying is we can't say that came about as a result of a principle, because principles are unknowable because our senses can't touch a principle. And since senses are primary, principles are unknowable and therefore don't really exist to the human mind. So he takes that and he goes to the second level and shows why you have to have this idea of causation, why science has proven, demonstrated that physical principle is what's primary in science, causation. But then he says that runs into a certain limit. Whenever you get into the question of the human being, of free will, you can't locate free will and the actions of the human being simply from the standpoint of causation, in the sense of looking at the unfolding of a process and saying, okay, human action or human evolution is the result of an evolution from the past. He says you have to go to the domain of metaphysics, which is above and outside of that lower domain of physical science, of even just reason. And so, similar to Cusa, he then goes this higher notion of the creator, of this connection between the unique connection of the human being to the creator, what he discusses the metaphysical domain. Now let's read the paragraph, the way he ends this chapter 3. He kind of summarizes it a bit. Where he says, we started on the territory of a special science and have dealt with a series of problems that are of a purely physical character. But these have led us from the world of mere sense perception to the real metaphysical world. And this world faces us with the impossibility of knowing it directly. It is a land of mystery. It is a world whose nature cannot be comprehended by our human powers of mental conception. But we can perceive its harmony and beauty as we struggle towards an understanding of it. And here, on the threshold of this metaphysical world, we have been brought face to face with the highest question of all, that of the freedom of the human will. It is a question which each one must meditate upon for himself, if he thinks at all seriously on what the meaning of this life may be. And so he gets to that problem. He says there's clearly, as he acknowledged elsewhere, though mind is primary, when we get to this question of mind, of the unique human will, we can no longer deal with it in our typical mode of physical science. We have to go somewhere higher. We have to go into the metaphysical domain. Now, for Planck, it still remains very much a question. He wrestles with it in various chapters throughout this book. He keeps coming back to that question, wrestling with it, knowing that there's a problem in the way it's being approached, knowing that there's a way to get at it, but he's still wrestling. Now, I think this then is where Vernadsky has an advantage. Because where Planck, Einstein, and others, though profound thinkers, and though very much informed by real classical art, I mean, as we've discussed elsewhere, Einstein, there's the whole discussion of Einstein and his violin, the fact that Einstein said he thought in music, that when he wanted to get insight into a physical problem, he went and played his violin. So he was connected to it, but the domain of science which he investigated was very much an abiotic domain. And so he was always dealing with and wrestling with what might be considered as abiotic processes, similar to Planck. He's dealing with electromagnetism, he's dealing with things on the quantum scale. But where they never really took their investigation explicitly was into the domain of life. And whenever someone like Schrodinger did, he totally failed. Not to say that Planck and Einstein would have failed in the same way, but they never really just went there. That wasn't their domain. That was Vernadsky's domain. And I think that's what gave Vernadsky a certain advantage, because it's a domain which is much more, when approached honestly and rigorously, is open to expression of very different ideas of things like space and time. Right? The space of living action is very different than the general space of non-living action. And this is expressed in what Vernadsky looked at as the principles developed by Pasteur and then Curie of dissymmetry, that life always expresses a spatial characteristic of dissymmetry. It has a kind of directionality to it. And as we've discussed before, also he was groping at this idea of Riemann, of the difference between a Riemannian space, what he discussed as a curved space, a space of change, as opposed to a simple Euclidean space, a flat space, a symmetrical space. And so life lent itself to an expression of a very different kind of space. It also lent itself to a very different kind of time, right? Not the time of the reversible, non-directional time of entropy, but a very different time, a directional time, an anti-entropic time. And just to give you a sense of that from Vernadsky, this is from his paper, Problems of Biogeochemistry 2, which also can be found on our website, on the 21st Century site. And here he does this, at a certain point, he does this kind of breakdown of the difference between living and non-living processes. And he shows in different conditions, under different circumstances, what the differences are. As to what we would consider time and entropy, so with inert natural bodies, one of his categories, he says, all natural processes in the domain of natural inert bodies, with the exception of radioactivity, reduce the free energy of the biosphere. Physiochemical processes are reversible. In this way, the free energy of the biosphere is diminished and its entropy is increased. But when we look at this from the standpoint of living natural bodies, he says, natural processes of living matter, as reflected in the biosphere, increase the free energy of the biosphere, that is, decrease its entropy. As a result of that process, the free energy of the biosphere increases, thus showing the fundamental importance of living matter in the structure of the biosphere and thereby the planet. So when you go into life, you see a very different quality in time. Right here we're looking at something, entropy is often thought of as an expression of time or something which unfolds, an unfolding of time or a reflection of it. In life, we see a directionality. We see an actual increase in complexity of development over quote-unquote time. So I think because of Vernadsky's investigations into life as his first primary subject, he was dealing with it was presented with very different evidence of a different idea of space, of time. And that really then informed his ability to develop an even higher idea of the noosphere, his investigation of the human mind, his investigation of the human role in the universe. And so we see that in many of his writings where you'll see in a number of his writings he does bring up the noosphere, but often kind of at the very end, after he does a very thorough development of the biosphere and shows this anti-entropic evolution of processes and takes on questions of the problem with the idea of abiogenesis and other things, something which Megan Roulard has dealt with pretty extensively. And just to give a quote from Vernadsky, this is from a paper which our colleague Megan Roulard translated, which can also be found on the website. This is a paper called On the Conditions of the Appearance of Life on Earth, where he really takes on this idea of abiogenesis, says what is the nature of life on the planet, and comes to some very interesting ideas about the fact that you couldn't have just a organism pop up on Earth, that life in its essence has a sort of symbiotic nature to it, that life emerges as a process in the biosphere, that life can't exist independent of the biosphere, and that life is never found as just a living form. You don't just find a living thing. You always find a living domain. It exists as a domain. But within that, he also does make reference to the noosphere, to man. And so he says, it is not until the moment of the appearance of civilized humanity in the biosphere that one organism found itself capable on its own of producing simultaneously varied chemical processes, but achieving this by its intelligence and technology, and not by the physiological work of its structure. So in this process of investigation, he does start to see there's something fundamentally unique about the human being. It's volitional. There's a will. It's human creative will, which is able to bring about these even higher changes in the biosphere. And he expresses that more thoroughly in a paper which is explicitly geared towards that, a paper called Some Words About the Noosphere, also by Vernadsky, which can be found on the 21st Century site, where he shows sort of how the way he understood the nature of the noosphere and the difference of the noosphere from the biosphere. And so in a section which is titled, How Can Thought Change Material Processes? Very good question. He says, here a new riddle has arisen before us. Thought is not a form of energy. How then can it change material processes? That question has not as yet been solved. As far as I know, it was first posed by an American scientist born in Lvov, the mathematician and biophysicist Alfred Lotka, but he was unable to solve it. As Goethe, not only a great poet but a great scientist as well, once rightly remarked, in science we only can know how something occurred, but we cannot know why it occurred. I don't know about that. As for the coming of the noosphere, we see around us at every step the empirical results of that incomprehensible process, that mineralogical rarity, native iron, is now being produced by the billions of tons. Native aluminum, which never before existed on our planet, is now produced in any quantity. The same is true with regard to the countless number of artificial chemical combinations, biogenic cultural minerals newly created on our planet. The number of such artificial minerals is constantly increasing. All of the strategic raw materials belong here. Chemically, the face of our planet, the biosphere, is being sharply changed by man, consciously and even more so, unconsciously. The aerial envelope The land as well as all of the natural waters are changed both physically and chemically by man. And so he starts to get at a way where you can start to, in a sense, measure the effect of man in the universe as expressed in its change on the biosphere. That man creates willfully higher states of organization. He's able to create new concentrations of materials, to create processes which were literally impossible simply under the influence of life, which now occur under the willful direction of man. And I think that because of that, because of this insight that he had into the nature of the noosphere, that ironically, despite what many people might, what their perception of the Russian might be, of the Russian pessimist might be, in fact, Vernadsky expresses a higher degree of optimism than any of these other scientists. I think because of his insight into the noosphere. And we see that optimism expressed in the way he concludes this paper on the noosphere, where he says, quote, "Now we live in the period of a new geological evolutionary change in the biosphere. We are entering the noosphere. This new elemental geological process is taking place at a stormy time in the epoch of a destructive world war. But the important fact is that our democratic ideals are in tune with the elemental geological process, with the law of nature, and with the noosphere. Therefore, we may face the future with confidence. It is in our hands. We will not let go." And so I think he had that optimism because of this insight into a higher idea, into a true understanding of what the nature of man was, of the emergence of this new force in the universe, this self-conscious force of the noosphere. And, as Mr. LaRouche has said, it's not a concept which has yet been fully developed or comprehended, but it shows us where we need to go, what the fight really is. And I think that's the challenge that's been put before us, to further take up that challenge of discovering and understanding this principle of the noosphere and moving it forward. But obviously, that requires taking up this immediate political fight that we started with, that there are great challenges to the noosphere now by the forces of Zeus, of Satan, what have you, as embodied in this empire, as embodied in their lackey, their dupe, Obama, and what he presents as a real existential threat to all of civilization. But I think armed with these kinds of ideas and this insight, we can, like Vernadsky, go forward with confidence that this enemy can be known and can be defeated, and that what we have in our hands is a much more powerful weapon, namely the principle of truth. So I'll leave it at that, and we can open up for some discussion or any other comments.
Yeah, I think it's critical to note, Mr. LaRouche put out this 4-point program, right? The 4-point policy for the United States. And he goes through and breaks down the exact policy framework needed to address the immediate crisis. But he situates it all exactly from this standpoint. Mm-hmm. He concludes his entire thematic policy piece as what he presented as the program needed to save the United States, to save the world, with the last section being Vernadsky on man and creation. Mm-hmm. Because if you take all of this together, you just went through this whole arc of different minds struggling against the development of science and the attacks of these reductionists and the attempt to bring out and develop this conception of mankind as the basis of science in the universe. If you take Mr. LaRouche's view on these triads, this triadic development, looking at the relationship between Planck, Einstein, Vernadsky, and what does he say in this 4-point piece? You have, with the development of sense perception completely fails to measure mankind. Yeah. You look at Einstein's work, and the large conceptions of sense perception fail. You look at Planck's work, and the small notions of sense perception fail to measure action in the small. It's a reflection of the type of development you had in the beginning of science with Kusa, Brunelleschi, and Kepler. And then you have with Vernadsky, you have, as you discussed, the beginning of studying creative processes per se. Life as a principle of the universe, as a process of the universe. And the highest expression of creative action being mankind's willful creative action, mankind's ability to wield thought as a force in the universe, as a willful condition of the human species. As Mr. LaRouche says here, this now defines the metrics of science. That we're poised to completely shatter from the idea that we need to measure science and mankind's relationship to the universe from the standpoint of simple sense perceptual notions, from this whole reductionist framework, from the second law of thermodynamics, this whole reductionist paradigm, and put up front and center as a scientific principle the idea that mankind expresses the highest form of action in the universe that we know of, and therefore basing policy, the relations among nations, the economic, political, strategic policy must be subsumed under a new, positive, scientifically defined conception that we saw these people struggling with, Einstein, Planck, Vernadsky, struggling with defining a scientifically rigorous notion of mankind's existence and relationship in the universe. And now that needs, as Mr. LaRouche puts it clearly in his policy perspective, this needs to become the basis of the policy for the recovery program.